Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to come to this event. So I call my talk Sanitation, What's the Real Problem? Okay, I'm an engineer, so you just need to understand that as I'm going to talk about technology. But the real reason why we're in such a mess with sanitation in the world actually can't be to do with the technology. We have a range of proven sanitation technologies which we know are appropriate and affordable in all situations that we can, or almost all situations that we can envisage in developing countries. So, Arbaloos, single pit VIP latrines, etequini latrines, the type used in the area around Durban, porphyroid latrines, very popular in cultures which use water for anal cleansing, particularly Asia, but not exclusively. Household level biogas latrines, popular in some countries, particularly, for example, in villages which are really small towns, but they're called villages, near Hanoi in Vietnam, where people, each household will have 3 or 4 pigs, as well as maybe 2 or 3 children. And so the human excreta and the pig excreta go into a biogas generator, and the biogas is used in the kitchen for cooking the family's food. Simplified sewerage, low-cost combined sewerage, and community-managed sanitation blocks. As has been mentioned, we live in an urbanising world, a rapidly urbanising world, but this is from the World Urbanisation Prospects, the 2010 revision, or 2009 revision, published in the middle of last year. Almost all population growth in the world after 2020 is going to be in urban areas in developing countries. And we can guess confidently that most of that population growth will be of poor people. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about 2 of these sanitation technologies. And I would say to you, even if you're not engineers and you've not heard of all these, know what they are, I'm not saying you should know how to design them, then you should find out. So I'm just going to show a few slides about simplified sewerage and a few slides about community-managed sanitation blocks. Okay, simplified sewerage, the Brazilians also call it condominial sewerage. It was developed in the very early 1980s in northeast Brazil. And these sewers are designed hydraulically in a very, very rigorous way. In fact, more rigorously than we normally design conventional sewers. We use a minimum sewer diameter of 100 millimeters, whereas conventional sewerage probably uses a minimum of 150. In some countries like Pakistan, it's a minimum of 225 millimeters. We ensure that it doesn't get blocked by designing the sewer gradient such that there is a minimum tractive tension at peak flow, that's sort of equivalent to a minimum self-cleansing velocity of 1 Newton per square meter. And we use a minimum value for the peak wastewater flow of 1.5 litres per second, which is roughly the flow induced in the sewer when you flush a toilet. Conventional engineers will say 100 millimetres is much too small for the diameter of the sewer. But there's a good hydraulic dictum which says small flows flow better in small pipes. And if you have an unnecessarily large pipe, you will actually get that blocked much more frequently than a correctly sized small pipe. All this results in a minimum gradient, sewer gradient, of 1 in 200. So over 200 metres horizontally, the top end of the sewer and the bottom end are a metre different in elevation. So we have a minimum gradient of 1 in 200, very flat, and that actually means that when you employ contractors to lay those sewers at such flat gradients, you have to train them so that you know they're capable of laying them correctly. and 100 millimetre, that's the minimum diameter, sewer being able to serve over 200 households of 5 people, each having a water consumption of 100 litres per person per day. That's a sort of typical 5 people per household in Brazil with a water consumption of about 100, maybe a bit less, maybe 80 litres per person per day. Why it is so good is because it's much better than conventional sewerage, where the wastewater generating parts of the house are normally at the back of the house, kitchen, toilet, showers, etc. So you have quite long house connections into sewers in the middle of the road. And that's very expensive. And we know that's really expensive due to the work John Calvert-Matten did at the World Bank in the World Bank research project on low-cost sanitation between 1976 and 1978. Simplified or condominial sewerage, we have 3 options: front yard, backyard, sidewalk, and which one you choose depends what type of people you're serving. For rich people in Brasilia, they opt for the front yard and they pay a bit more for that. But really, in poor areas, then it's the backyard or in-block sewer which is most appropriate. Because it's simply cheapest. We have a much lower length of sewer. Obviously you need some street sewers, but the length of street sewer is much reduced. And this has a huge effect on costs. So these are costs from the city of Natal, where simplified sewerage was first installed in 1981 in northeast Brazil. These are costs from 1983. At low population densities, sewerage, whether it's conventional or simplified, is very expensive because you have long pipe lengths per plot. But as the population density increases, the cost of sewerage falls dramatically. And the important thing about this graph is it shows that simplified sewerage, this curve here, becomes cheaper than on-site systems, which are in fact poor flush toilets, at a population density of about 160, 170 people per hectare. And they did some work in South Africa and they came up with a figure of, the equivalent figure of one person, sorry, 200 people per hectare. Which is not a very high density, actually, quite low. And this is how much it cost the supervisor. This is the cost 3 years ago, January 2008, in the state of Rio Grande do Norte, which is the state which has the capital, Natal. And in these low-income areas, these are not slum areas, these are low-income areas, and the water supply is a single tap to each house from the piped supply. And this is an unmetered supply. And it's assumed, but nobody knows and nobody really cares, that the water consumption is about 15 cubic metres per household per month. For that, they pay what the Brazilians call the minimum water tariff, which 3 years ago was equivalent to exactly $10 US. If they have a simplified sewerage connection, then they pay a surcharge of 35% of their water bill, so $3.50 per month. And that, $3.50, was equivalent to just under 2% of the local minimum wage, what the Brazilians call one minimum salary. So that's clearly affordable, and the Dublin Statement says there's the basic right of all human beings to have access to clean water and sanitation at an affordable price, and that sanitation is clearly affordable. And it's a sewer system which people in urban areas, certainly in Brazil and many other countries, actually want. You don't have to have vast amounts of water. It was installed in part of Orangi in Karachi in the mid-80s in a minority Christian community who had hand-carried water supplies from public standpipes of about 27 litres per person per day, and the simplified sewer system, designed according to these Brazilian principles, worked perfectly and was very cheap. Okay, slums. This happens to be Mathare slum in Nairobi, but could really be anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a slide of a partial view of a community-managed sanitation block in Kibera, another huge slum in Nairobi. Everybody says it's the largest slum in sub-Saharan Africa, with a population of, who knows, it depends which report you read, but it could be anywhere between 750,000 people and 1 million people. Something like that. And it's divided into villages and all that sort of thing. It looks very much like the previous slide. So these sanitation facilities, communal facilities, were funded as a sort of experiment by UN Habitat and constructed by a local NGO called Margina Ufanisi, which is Water and Development, and the Soweto East community, that's one of the villages. And so it was built and put into practice by the Executive Director of Habitat in November 2008. So this is the men's side. So there's a wash hand basin there. There's water available here for anal cleansing. There are toilets, and there is a shower. And then you basically, sorry, the capital cost. Each of these blocks is designed to serve about 3,000 people. And the capital cost, construction cost, is $8 per person. Not expensive. And actually, it's a water and sanitation block. People come and they fill up their water containers and they pay for the water. And all the wastewater from the toilets and the showers discharge into a sewer, a trunk sewer, which ran through the site before the slum built itself over it. And that connection to the sewer is made by the Nairobi Water and Sewerage Company. And this is the back of the front door, which is obviously open, and this tells you the local prices. It's payment on a per-use basis. And to use the toilet, it costs 3 Kenya shillings. They're about 130 to the pound, so that's 2p. To use the toilet, to have a shower is 5, so that's about 4p. And 20 litres of water is, again, about 2p. And then children who come along and collect 5 litres pay a lot. In fact, they've just reduced it from a shilling to 50 cents. So it's a very good system. UN Habitat, there are a lot of these in this particular part of Kibera, and UN Habitat has just finished a large survey, user survey of the system, so asking the people who use it what they think about it, if they've got any comments, do they find it affordable, do they use it at night, and so on, all this sort of thing. What do women in particular think of it? Do they like to go there at night or not? And if they don't, what do they do if they need to go to the toilet and that sort of thing? And that survey data is being analysed at the moment. But the general impression is the local people like this very much. And as you go in, you pay, and you're given toilet paper. And if you're going to have a shower, you're given soap as well. Okay, I'd like to ask a question. Where does all the blame lie? The blame for the 1 to 2 billion people who do not have an adequate water supply. The 3 to 4 billion people who don't have adequate sanitation. The nearly 1.2 billion open defecators, and the very low percentage of wastewater that is treated. So this is the ridiculous situation we have in the sanitation sector in the world. Whose fault is it? My answer, very simply, is the blame now rests fairly and squarely with developing country governments. Those governments that have chosen not to invest in water and sanitation for all their citizens and to passively accept the resulting morbidity and mortality. And they've chosen not to treat wastewater and not to prevent the use of untreated wastewater for crop irrigation. We've heard this morning, we've had these regional sanitation conferences, all these international meetings. Everybody says, oh, we're going to give water and sanitation for everybody by the end of the decade, by the end of the year, whatever. And nothing happens. We get good declarations. This is from Africa Sound 2, but not much action. And when we go back, as John mentioned, to Kigali for Africa Sound 3, this July, we'll hear all the same problems we heard in Durban in 2008. But some countries have done very well. For example, Malaysia in 2008, these are the JMP figures published in 2010, urban Malaysia, 96% had improved sanitation and 4% shared sanitation. In the rural areas, 95% of the population had improved access to improved sanitation, 4% to shared, and 1% to nothing, open defecators. Thailand, in 2008, urban areas, 95% of the urban population had access to improved sanitation and 5% to shared, but otherwise improved sanitation. And in the rural areas, 96% improved, 4% shared, and essentially no open defecation. The question is, why have these two countries in particular done so well? And all the industrialised countries, because we all have similar figures. Is it because they've all thought clean? Quite a few countries don't seem to think clean. If you ask the Minister of Health in Thailand why his country has done so well, he will say, well, in the rural areas, for which his ministry has responsibility, he said, we have steadily invested every year for the past 25, 30 years. We've just got on and done it. Because that ministry happened to think it was an important thing to do, and so did it, even though it took them 20, 25 years. Quite a few countries don't seem to think clean, as judged by the number of countries with more than 20% open defecators. Again, figures for 2008. 20% was chosen because the developing world as a whole, 21% of the developing world population are open defecators. That's 1 in 5. So large numbers of African countries, Asian countries, India 54%, but because the Indian population is so large, actually 54% of 1.1 billion is a huge number, and it's about half all the open defecators in the world live in India. And in Latin America, Caribbean, we have a couple of countries, Bolivia and Haiti. So, this should tell us something. It should make us ask, why are other countries not doing as well as Malaysia and Thailand? Well, there must be many reasons, of which I'm sure you can think of many more than me. But, for example, politicians and senior civil servants don't seem to think that thinking clean is important. And as we all know, there are no solutions without political solutions. If you have a politician who's got a flush toilet, does he really get terribly concerned about people in his constituency who don't have flush toilets or don't have any form of sanitation and are open defecators. I've always thought you can judge how serious a country is about sanitation by visiting the toilets in the Ministry of Health headquarters building. And then, if you're lucky enough to have a meeting with the Minister of Health, get yourself into his toilet. And there'll be a huge difference in the status between those two toilets. Technical ignorance of local engineers and planners. Really important. Of that list of sanitation technologies, if you went into a municipality in virtually any developing country and asked if anybody there knew what an arbaloo was, if it was a rural area, or what simplified sewage was, they just would not know. I had a Colombian PhD student a few years ago. She's now the director of Sanari Institute at the University of Valle in Cali. And she showed me, she did a lot of work with local communities, and she was trying to find out why local water supply and sanitation projects for the poor almost always failed in her part of Colombia. And she showed me a piece of paper which was 1 metre wide and 3 metres long. So a big piece of paper. And it was covered in writing by lots and lots of different people. And she looked me straight in the eye and said, from this I can tell the most important reason why water supply and sanitation projects fail in this part of Colombia. And she said, it's because the local engineers and planners do not know what options are available. She said the second most important reason is because they're so badly paid, they have to have at least another job. So 1 or 2 other jobs. But because they can be sacked quite easily from these extra jobs, they devote all their intellectual efforts to these extra jobs. And then they suddenly realise, maybe a couple of months before the end of the financial year, oh, we haven't spent the budget the municipality has given us. And so, because actually to design and implement a project for poor people is quite difficult, it's either done very badly or it's not done for the very poor. So the very poor don't get served. And there's too much corruption generally in the water sector. There's too much corruption, full stop, but in the water sector there's a lot of corruption, which pushes up the cost of water connections in urban areas significantly, maybe by almost 50%. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.